There's a moment, quiet, not peaceful, not soft, but quiet like the night before a war. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort you. It studies you, tests you, and asks how much more can you take. I remember standing there, not as a king, not as a warrior, but as a man with shaking hands and a heart that had begged too many times. The air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to either break or rise. Every man reaches a point where his soul bends, where his knees touch the ground, not out of strength, but out of exhaustion. I was there, bent, not broken, still holding on to the hope that someone, anyone, would hear my last pleas. But they didn't. That's what begging does. It doesn't just weaken your body. It robs your power, grain by grain, word by word, until your voice no longer belongs to you, until your worth is weighed by their mercy. Begging is a slow execution. You die with every plea. You bury your pride in the hands of those who will never lift you. And when the last plea falls into silence, the world doesn't clap. It doesn't save you. It simply moves on, as if your pain was nothing more than background noise. That silence, it tasted like iron, like blood in the mouth, like shame sitting in the lungs. It burned, not because they turned away, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to stand. That was the night I stopped waiting for hands to reach back. I stared at the empty space where I once knelt, and something inside me shifted. See, every man has a breaking point, but some of us, we don't break, we harden. We turn into something the world wasn't ready to face. The moment I hit the bottom, I didn't find mercy. I found fire. I didn't find light. I found a forge. Pain didn't end me. It reforged me. And for the first time, I saw the throne, not as something given, but as something taken. Not a seat to be offered, but a kingdom to be claimed. Every plea I once made became a brick in the empire I would build. Every tear I wasted became the steel of my crown. Because the throne is never gifted to the beggar. It's conquered by the silent. And that night, I went silent. I stopped explaining my worth. I stopped proving my loyalty. I stopped kneeling. I rose, not with a roar, but with a vow only I could hear. The world didn't notice, but the fire inside me did. It whispered back. It said, "Good, now take it all." That day, I didn't lose. I stopped asking to be saved. Before the fire came, there was an era I now call the Age of Kneeling. A time when I thought loyalty meant silence. When I believed love was something earned through suffering. When I waited on my knees for the world to hand me a crown it never intended to give. You see, they teach men to crawl long before they teach them to walk. They dress it up with pretty words, patience, humility, kindness. But beneath the surface, it's obedience. They don't want you strong. They want you silent. They want you begging. I bent my back for people who wouldn't lift a finger for me. I stood in the rain while they built their shelters. I handed them the torch while standing in the dark. And when they took everything, I smiled because I was taught that good men wait their turn, but a man who waits dies in the line of his own hope. I remember the faces, the ones I looked up to, the ones I loved. They didn't push me down. No, they just watched me kneel, watched me lower myself, watched me trade my roar for a whisper, and they called it loyalty. I used to confuse loyalty with slavery, love with chains, respect with tolerance. But there's a quiet cruelty in being the man who always understands, the man who never leaves, the man who always forgives. They don't love him, they use him. Because a man who kneels too long becomes furniture in their kingdom. The world doesn't reward kindness. It consumes it, tears it apart, then wonders why men turn to stone, why wolves stop wagging their tails. There was a night when I stared at my own reflection. I didn't recognize the man in the mirror. His spine curved, his eyes tired, his voice hollow. He wasn't a king. He wasn't even a man. He was a ghost wearing a human name. That's what begging does. It doesn't just take your voice. It steals your shape. It carves out everything that made you a storm and replaces it with silence. I waited for them to see me, to choose me, to lift me, but they were never going to. Because why would anyone give a throne to the one already kneeling before it? And that's the cruelty of the age of kneeling. You convince yourself that your suffering is noble, that silence is strength, that begging is patience. But it's not. It's rot, slow, silent, beautiful on the outside, deadly beneath. And when that truth hit me, it didn't whisper, it thundered. It ripped through the fragile shell I had built around my broken pride. It shattered me, not to end me, but to expose what I truly was. I was never born to kneel. I was conditioned to. I was taught to lower my eyes when I should have stared back, taught to hold my tongue when I should have bared my teeth, taught to serve when I was born to rule. And that realization, it didn't free me, it angered me. Like a caged beast remembering its claws, like a fallen god remembering his name. The world had written my story in chains, and for years I read it like scripture. But that night, I picked up the pen, I carved my rage into the silence. I etched my vow into the walls of my mind. No more begging, no more waiting, no more kneeling before the undeserving. Because the age of kneeling ends the day you look at your own reflection and refuse to bow to it. It doesn't happen in light, it happens in darkness, when the world turns its back and leaves you to rot. That's where kings are born. Not in palaces, but in shadows. The man who kneels is forgotten. The man who stands shakes empires. And I was done kneeling. Betrayal doesn't knock. It doesn't arrive with warning signs or loud footsteps. It waits, smiling. It wears the face you trusted the most, the voice you swore would never lie, the hands you thought would never let go. And then, when your knees are already bruised from kneeling, when your soul is still whispering, please, it strikes, quiet, precise, like a blade slipped between ribs. I didn't bleed out in a battlefield. I bled out in silence, in empty rooms where laughter once lived, in glances that used to hold warmth, now colder than steel, in words that didn't need to be spoken, because betrayal doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just walks away. I had trusted faces, names carved into the walls of my loyalty. They didn't destroy me with hate. They destroyed me with indifference. They didn't stab me. They simply left me to die in a war I fought alone. And here's the cruel truth. Betrayal doesn't come from your enemies. It's too intimate for that. It only comes from those who once held your hand. The blade hurts more when it's kissed with memory. I remember the night. The air was still, the world quiet, and all that echoed in my mind was their silence. Not a single word, not a single reach. Just nothing. And nothing can be louder than the silence of those who swore they'd never leave. It burned, not like fire, but like acid. Slow, cold, consuming. I begged in ways no one saw. I screamed in places no one heard. And they watched. They watched me drown while calling it my lesson. That night, something inside me cracked. Not loud, not dramatic, just a clean, cold fracture. And from that fracture, something darker breathed for the first time. The pain I once tried to escape became fuel. Every memory became a spark. Every betrayal a match. Every silence a storm building in my chest. I stopped crying that night, not because it didn't hurt, but because the tears finally learned. They were wasted. See, betrayal isn't just what they did, it's what it awakened. It awakened the part of me that stopped waiting for apologies, that stopped needing closure, that stopped expecting anyone to return. That's the thing about being left in ashes. You learn to build with fire. Their betrayal didn't bury me. It baptized me in rage, in resolve, in a darkness that no longer begged to be understood. I whispered their names like a vow, not out of love, out of memory, out of the oath to never let their absence be my cage again. I started to walk differently after that night. No more dragging steps, no more looking back. The fire was under my feet now, and the irony, they thought they ended me, but they only built the man they feared I'd become. I became quieter, colder, every breath sharpened like a blade, every heartbeat a drum of war. I stopped asking why they left, and started asking what I'll build without them. Because when you've been betrayed like that, you stop chasing softness. You start forging crowns. The ashes they left me in became the soil of something greater. I buried my weakness there, and from that grave, a king rose. Their betrayal didn't kill me, it crowned me. And whether they know it or not, they created their own reckoning. There comes a night when the noise dies, when the begging stops echoing, when the rage stops screaming, and only silence remains. Not the silence of surrender, no, the silence of something awakening. That night, I didn't announce my pain anymore. I didn't explain my worth anymore. I didn't ask anymore. I simply went quiet. And that silence felt like war. The world had grown used to my noise, to my pleading, to my patience. They mistook my kindness for weakness, my love for permission, my hope for chains. But the moment I went silent, everything shifted. I stopped moving like a man waiting to be chosen, and started moving like a storm no one could stop. Silence is misunderstood. They think it's emptiness. But silence is where men are reborn, where rage is tempered, where crowns are forged in shadows. When you go silent, the world grows nervous, because they can no longer predict your steps, no longer control your voice, no longer feed on your desperation. I spent nights with no words, just a heartbeat, a steady, slow heartbeat, like a drum before a battle. I trained my soul to breathe without begging, to stand without applause, to burn without being seen. Every apology I wanted to give died in that silence. Every word I wanted to scream faded into the dark, and what was left was pure, cold, unshakable. I became a ghost to their expectations. I disappeared from their story and began writing my own. No warning, no explanations, just silence that grew heavier than any roar. People fear a man who stops talking because they can no longer measure his weakness. They can't feed off his insecurities. They can't predict his next move. And for the first time, I wasn't begging at their gates. I was building my own. I learned to move in shadows, to build without noise, to heal without announcing, to sharpen my rage without spilling it on those unworthy of it. My silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. The battlefield of kings isn't the loudest arena. It's the quiet forge in the dark. I cut the strings that tied me to their world, the chains disguised as loyalty, the weight disguised as love. And in that stillness, I rose. I didn't need their apologies anymore. I didn't need their recognition anymore. The man who begged was gone. What stood in his place was something colder, sharper, unshakable. I didn't roar, I whispered, and even that whisper felt like thunder to those who once ignored me. That night, I became untouchable, because silence is power. It isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of a decision to no longer seek what doesn't deserve your hands. The night I went silent was the night I became dangerous. Because nothing terrifies this world more than a man who no longer needs it. The silence didn't last forever. It was never meant to. Silence was the forge, but war was the language I was born to speak. The moment I stood from the ashes, I felt it. The shift in the air. The world no longer looked the same, no longer felt the same. And I was no longer the man who once begged. They thought my silence meant defeat, but it was preparation. Every second I vanished, I was sharpening, training, hardening, turning myself into something they could no longer touch or tame. I didn't return with tears. I returned with fire, not a scream, a storm. The war for the crown doesn't start with noise. It starts with footsteps, calm, heavy, certain, the kind of steps that don't ask for permission. They claim what's theirs. I moved like a man possessed by purpose. No more explaining, no more waiting, no more lowering my eyes. My hands were no longer open. They were clenched into fists. And those who once ignored me, they felt the air shift before they saw me. Because power doesn't announce itself, it arrives. I started to build, not with wood and stone, but with pain, with hunger, with scars. The same scars they thought would break me became the pillars of my empire. While they were laughing, I was lifting. While they were talking, I was training. While they were sleeping, I was becoming something they'd fear. That's what war looks like. Not chaos, discipline, not rage, focus. I cut off everything that made me small, every habit that kept me weak, every voice that tried to keep me kneeling. I didn't ask to be stronger. I became it. This world doesn't respect the man who begs. It respects the one who takes. And I was done waiting for a seat at their table. I was here to build my own throne. Every scar became a weapon. Every betrayal became armor. Every sleepless night became a soldier marching under my name. They called me cold, good. They called me distant, better. They called me dangerous, perfect. Because to take a crown, you must first stop fearing blood. And I did. The war wasn't with them, not really. The war was with the version of me that once thought he needed them. I killed that version in silence, and from his grave, the king rose. They won't tell you this, but kings are never born. They're made in darkness, in pain, in nights where no one claps, where no one believes in you, where your roar is heard only by your own shadow. I didn't walk toward the throne. I marched. I didn't ask for the key. I broke down the door, and the same people who once turned their backs now turn their heads when I enter the room. Not because I begged, because I became the storm they feared. Power doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from deciding that you don't need to be. And that's the truth every beggar eventually learns. The world bows to the man who stops asking. There's a moment, after all the silence, after all the pain, after all the war, when the world finally looks up, not because you asked, but because they can't look away. The crown doesn't call your name when you're begging. It waits. It waits for the man who stops crawling, the man who stops apologizing for existing, the man who builds himself into the storm no one saw coming. I stood before the gates I once begged to enter, the same gates where I whispered please with a trembling voice. But I wasn't whispering anymore. I wasn't asking anymore. I wasn't the man they left on his knees. I was the storm they didn't prepare for. The guards didn't open the door. They didn't have to, because kings don't wait for permission. They tear the gates off their hinges. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their applause. The throne was never theirs to give. It was mine to take. I walked through halls built on arrogance, through corridors where they once laughed behind closed doors. And now, they fell silent, because power doesn't argue. It arrives, and everything else bows. They had crowned me a beggar. I returned a king, not out of revenge, out of reclamation. This wasn't about them anymore. This was about me, about the man who chose to rise when no one believed in him, about the fire that burned quietly for years, until it devoured everything in its path. The throne wasn't golden, it wasn't wrapped in silk. It was built from pain, betrayal, silence, and scars. It was forged from the very things they thought would break me. I didn't sit on it with a smile. I sat with a storm in my eyes. Because this crown wasn't inherited, it was earned in blood and fire. And now, when they speak my name, they don't say it with pity. They say it with weight, with respect, with a hint of fear. Because the man who begged is dead, and the one who replaced him doesn't kneel. I no longer knock on doors. I build kingdoms. I no longer wait to be chosen. I choose myself. I no longer reach out my hand. I extend my rule. You see, the crown never belonged to the loudest. It belonged to the one who endured in silence. The one who learned to bend without breaking. The one who turned pain into an empire. And when that crown touches your head, everything slows down. The noise fades. The past becomes a shadow at your feet. You don't need to prove anything anymore. Your existence is the proof. They look at you differently now, not because you changed overnight, but because you stopped living beneath them. You stopped living in their world. You built your own. That's the thing about power. You can't beg for it. You become it. And when you become it, the world stops asking questions. They'll tell stories about how I rose, about the fire, about the war, about the throne. But what they'll never understand is that it all began the day I went silent. Not the day I was crowned, not the day they finally saw me, but the day I stopped asking. That day was quiet. No music, no applause. No one saw it happen, because true transformation never asks for witnesses. It happens in the dark, in the stillness of your own breath. I was a beggar once, a man who whispered for permission to matter, a man who broke his own spine trying to be enough. But that version of me died the night I buried my pleas. And in his place rose something colder, something they couldn't manipulate, something they couldn't touch. I stopped chasing love like it was oxygen, stopped proving my worth like it was currency, stopped kneeling before those who didn't deserve my shadow. And the world noticed, not because I shouted, but because my silence echoed louder than their noise. That's the truth they don't want you to learn. Power isn't loud. Power doesn't beg. Power doesn't need permission. Power waits for the moment you finally see yourself for what you are. They called me a monster when I stopped kneeling, a threat when I started standing, a king when I stopped caring. But the truth is simple. I didn't change. I remembered who I was before they taught me to kneel. Now when they speak my name, they lower their voices. Because the man they ignored is gone, and what stands in his place doesn't bow. My silence became my weapon. My pain became my crown. My rise became their reckoning. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it too. That whisper in the dark, the one that says, "This is your time." The one that reminds you, you were never meant to crawl. You were meant to conquer. I don't need their throne anymore, because I built my own. And now, the same world that made me beg kneels before the man who doesn't. I stopped begging for a seat at their table and built a throne they'll kneel before. Silence. I was never meant to ask for a crown. I was born to take it.